Great. So thank you so much again for the excellent presentations. I've learned a lot during this session. So I'll start with a few questions if that's okay. We'll still aim to head downstairs and have lunch for past, or a little earlier if people feel very, very hungry. So my first question is for Esfand. So we worked together on a very interesting project for the BCO, and I think your presentation really highlighted the lack of mandatory requirements and government incentives in this area, which in the report we really thought we really viewed as essential. So what do you think? What possible solutions could the government create to support the current market trends and create this critical mass that's needed in this transition towards net zero?
Very, very good question, and very difficult to answer, really. But I can think of a few ideas, actually. Minimum energy efficiency requirements were cited in Tim's presentation as well. So I think that right now, to a large extent, when it comes to operational energy and carbon, the only instrument that we have, policy instrument that we have, appears to be based on asset ratings and these EPC ratings. And there's overwhelming evidence in this country, also internationally, across the EU, that really this is not fit for purpose. You can't use asset rating as a basis for decarbonizing your building stock, achieve operational saving in use and so on and so forth. There are so many issues with that. So really, I think we need to move towards performance in use targets, ratings. Now in the context of the commercial real estate sector, there are not so many neighbors for that. Few years ago, there was suggestion, for example, to extend DEC to commercial sector. Of course, for that, we need more advanced and tailored benchmarks. But I think either way, whether it's DEC, neighbors, and other rating, it has to be based on performance in use. So I think that would be perhaps the first thing. And in terms of embodied carbon, I think I'll already referred to the fact that there are lags in terms of available EPDs in the market, building services, some material. Also, when you're dealing with, again, materials, building services, furniture that are at least partly reliant on imported, basically material from overseas, especially outside the EU. So that's quite challenging. That's one of the reasons we don't have these EPDs. But if there's a mandatory requirement, companies actually are very good at aligning the supply chains and demand their suppliers to provide the required data. I think that would be a big improvement. So one for operational and one for embodied.
Right, thanks so much. So performance is used for operational energy carbon, and well, we need more data and improved data and information for embodied carbon. And I think it was really interesting when we're doing those interviews to see that there was awareness, but people felt that they weren't supported enough. The mechanisms weren't there. So I'd like now to move to Homs, to Rakaya. So I mean, your presentation was really interesting. You really demonstrated challenges associated with the how to decarbonize housing stock. And again, the societal factors were also really important. Because as I said, we often think about the hard to treat building fabric, but not so much the societal impacts or factors that might make a home hard to treat / decarbonize. But it just made me think, and if it's so challenging and expensive to retrofit such a home, wouldn't it be easier to just demolish it? Would that be a solution? Or what are the challenges there?
Well, there are many reasons not to demolish homes. First of all, there are places where people live, and we have to kind of factor that into our thinking. We recently did something for the BBC about a person who was living in an estate which was due to be demolished, and he was refusing to leave it because it was his home. Another factor, and I think Esfand touched on this, is the embodied carbon element. Demolition always has a bigger embodied carbon impact than retrofit. Lots of research has been undertaken here at UCL by Esfand and my colleague Yair Schwartz, and they've shown that retrofitting, regardless of how difficult, how tricky, from the embodied carbon perspective, is more responsible.
Yeah. From an energy / carbon as well as social perspective. Thanks for these thoughts. Yes, please. Yeah.
You said that if more is going to be more just to increase the embodied carbon. But if we demolish it and we build like passive house building, which is really energy efficient building, are we going to say somehow, are we going to balance, let's say, the difference between the embodied carbon that we will produce during the demolition compared to the embodied carbon that we will save during the lifespan of that building?
We haven't specifically looked at passive house standard. However, with passive house standard, it is very expensive to build the passive house standard. There's a lot of issues which kind of have prevented the UK market from being able to deliver passive house standards at the rate which would be required. So there are issues with delivery on that, but we haven't specifically done a comparison between, on the operational side, between the a normal house and passive standard, because that's quite but very good question.
I'm a certified passive house designer. I can say that the difference like between 15 to 20% more expensive compared to traditional one. That's why I just wanted to.
Well, we recognise the benefits of passive house, and I teach passive house as part of the module for retrofit because we do believe it's very high quality. We've identified lots of issues in the supply chain here in the UK, which might impact our ability to deliver quality, so products as well as skill shortages. So the current landscape, I agree, it would be interesting to look at that comparison between something that is passive house level as an alternative to retrofit. But in the current landscape, we feel that it might not be deliverable at a level which would kind of balance that out. But I think it's a very good way of thinking about things.
Thank you for this. No, it's really interesting. I think a passive house building possibly creates a new paradigm for occupant use as well, MVHR and so on. So I think there is a lot of research to be done there, especially for some people who might be vulnerable, who might be moving from more traditional dwelling into this new paradigm. I'd like to ask a question to Tim. So again, a very interesting case study, and you raised some really important issues about current approaches towards decarbonization. So you mentioned electrical supply challenges as being one of the key constraints. Could you please elaborate, say a little bit more about this?
I think I went through a number of constraints, and of the ones that I went through, this is right up there as one of the biggest challenges. And I think it's somewhat under the radar. The electrical grid, the national grid's under huge pressure because of, as I mentioned, the widespread adoption of heat pumps and electric vehicles, and they just can't keep up. And so on Kingsley Outdoor Pool, or on the case study that I looked at, we had a really relatively small upgrade. So the supplier that was there, because it's an outdoor pool, they haven't got a huge electrical demand. So they had 41 kVA supply, which is, your house is about 23, to put it into perspective. So we asked for an upgrade just to 275 kVA. That took them 15 months to deliver from place of order. To put that into context, that's a relatively small development. And I would say Oxford's, whilst it's a widespread national issue, Oxford has got particular pressure on development. And a lot of that is driven by, there's a lot of development going on. There's a lot of science and research related development going on, which is quite intensive from an electrical perspective. But what it's meaning is we've seen development stopped at stage 2 because there's no power, because they can't have it till 2030. And we've got a job at the moment, which is on site, where a quotation was received for 2 MVA, for 2 new builds, about £60 million. They're coming out of the ground at the moment. Substructure's just been finished, and they've just retracted that offer. These are all electric buildings. So that's a real dilemma. They said we can have an updated quotation, but base it on 0.5 MVA. So what that actually means in reality is the only way to overcome that scenario is to put 2 40-foot shipping containers full of batteries on the site to deal with the peak demand periods. And that comes with its own challenge. We're going back to plans, space allocation. They're surprisingly noisy. because of the
Yeah.
ventilation systems that they've
which
got.
is so important for
Yeah.
well-being.
So that's problematic. So it really is a challenge. Now there is some hope here in that from tomorrow there's some sweeping legislation changes coming into play. So flexible tariffs are now an option. So what that does is they'll give us our 2 MVA on that site in question, but we can't have it for the two 2-hour peak periods a day. So that means we get a much smaller battery installation in to cater for just those periods. And they've also now, I think there's some legislation that's come in, which basically means that the national grid have to give you, if the issue is a transmission issue, it's not at a local level with a district network operator, it's with the national grid themselves, and they cannot give you the supply. They now have to give you 1 MVA a year. So things are moving forward, but it's definitely something that's not necessarily registered.
Yeah. So thanks for raising this, but it's good to hear about those legislative changes.
I'm not an expert, I'm so sorry, but I also heard issues to do with the single versus single phase supply in homes, actually limiting the for the home sector, limiting what products you can use from because international.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's also an issue.
Yeah. Yeah, because you've got single phase supplies, domestic premises, so that's, like I said, it's only 20 kVA, so you can't really, has to be sized with what's left. If you have a reasonable electrical consumption in the house, it might not necessarily meet the peak demand of the domestic.
Great, and from heat pumps, I'd like to move to one of my favorite topics, mold and moisture. And I always enjoy your pictures, Valentina. And I have lived in homes that probably were not as bad, but close. So I guess you covered this, but if you could just again summarize for the benefit of our audience, what are the main sources of moisture in a typical building? And I have actually observed in my neighborhood, new build homes presenting moisture and mold problems. So it's not necessarily limited to all properties. And yeah, again, if you could summarize the potential solutions to the problem.
Yes, yeah. Thanks for this. Yeah, I didn't cover much new build, but definitely there are a number of challenges related to new build as well. So we have the challenges between in new builds are normally related to junctions, detailing, and the buildability of details on site, and it's particularly important to provide shelter from rainwater during construction. So what we find, particularly with more novel methods like CLP, that they are not. I've seen a number of sites which don't have any moisture protection or any rainwater protection, and then they get closed up after. And this is when you start having a lot of moisture accumulation, but no drying allowed because you're closing up the fabric with vapor closed systems. Then this is a clear path for moisture issues. So thinking about, in general, for new build construction, you're thinking about allowing drying out if there is any wetting happening during the construction process. And this is the same when a new build home is given to occupants. There is construction moisture that needs to dry out. So allowing drying out is very important. We have one of our publications on the UCL website talks about construction in new build. And it's really important, particularly on the differential movements of the structure during the first period that will be related to moisture, that will likely to be related to moisture drying out, and this is very important. In retrofit, on the other hand, there are some other challenges. One is doing a retrofit that is not a whole house approach might lead to forget about ventilation. So insulating without providing ventilation, it's a real risk, and that is associated with indoor mold growth, but also having a coherent structure. So having a limited, like thinking about detailing carefully, and in retrofit is even more challenging than in new build, because in new build you can sit down, design your detail the best way possible, and then implement it. Whereas in retrofit you have a number of challenges related to the actual existing building that you're applying your new system onto. So that is a second challenge. And then the third challenge is the use of systems that allow drying out. So again, if there is any wetting, which is very likely to happen with time, we can have rainwater penetration, you can have air carrying moisture with that. If there is any wetting, we need to allow drying. So systems that allow drying without reaching excessive levels of moisture are more robust. And yeah, so
it's very useful. So would you say that's an issue of both, I guess, upskilling and better construction practices, as well as, I don't like the term training for occupants, but better information for the people moving into these retrofitted or new build properties?
I think more awareness. I think when we talk with occupants, some of them are quite scared of touching their building. Particularly if the retrofit, I've been working on a number of social housing related retrofit projects, and particularly if the retrofit is not initiated by them, but that is initiated by the council or someone else, they are not
have no control over the process.
Yes, so they're not familiar with, but rightly so, because they weren't part of the discussion. And that's what Rukaya was saying before, is we really need to have the occupants at the heart. It's not a tech, like we have the technology, we need to have them, not just guidance, but that's what we've started doing, providing guidance. But second, and even more important, is to put them at the heart of this, even if the funding comes from somewhere else, but they need to be involved. And they want to.
Yeah. This is a very important point. So on this, I would like to open the floor for more questions. One there. Can you also please introduce yourself? Thank you.
Sorry, very much sorry. Research. As a thing, the economies on balance, and especially being summertime, all of this noise you see kind of disappear. And then winter time comes, it reappears, but it's very, very heavy as well. I mean, if I run my own business, if for example I have someone that comes to my company, how can that provide solution for them to move forward? Was especially telling them about climate balance. I understand when you say about new build. After a couple of years, if this, especially with climate balance, is not really understood properly, it's still going to go on and on and on.
Yes, I think the best way to deal with this, thanks for your question, is to assess moisture balance in the long term. So as we are doing with overheating, for example, which is Anna's main line of research, when we think about 2050, 2080, we have climate science to help us assess that. We can do that with moisture. So we can assess different systems and different applications under different accreditations, different occupancy in considering future climate scenarios. And I think this is really important. What we are doing at the moment is assessing for today, actually assessing for yesterday, because we lived in the past climate time. 1995. But it's really important, and we have the data now, so hopefully we get more meaningful analysis that can help us. But I have to say, even with current climate time that we have now, we are still able to see what systems are robust, because there is always an opportunity to test the system test systems under different scenarios. And I think robustness needs to be more at the heart of our conversation, particularly in building fabric systems. And we're not necessarily building fabric, because a lot of the issues we're having are also with the escape of water and non-robust ducting. So that is and plumbing. So that is really robustness needs to be more important, particularly in a net zero future.
Construction is really important, and to make sure that the building is good insulated with insulation, and also interpretation recovery will help to balance the moisture in the space. So according to minimize thermal qualities, things like that will improve. Oh, sorry.
It's very good that us on this side will see it like that, but it's not the line was like doing the building and not really giving that to the tenant.
But if you can say the structure, that's important. Just not having what this continuous insulation, and tight, things like that. It's the only way.
Yeah. It's a very interesting style to work. It's very interesting because it was especially during the winter time, like, you know, like the lady that I'm studying on the countryside. I believe that I'm studying that, I'm observing it, like what how does this thing develop, because it's you know, people that have asthma cannot even live in a home, like house things. So, and I've been observing it for the past 30 years, like how is it there, and I understand it can come mostly heavy during the winter time. You know, and with some winter it's okay, you know, you can go out with your normal jacket. Some winter it's very, very cold, and people have to kind of laugh at the heating. And you know, that noise, you know, being in home, being kept in home is developing. Going up there, developing, or even around the whatever, it's a very, I don't like to see it.
That's why
It's very scary for me, and wasn't gonna have kids.
That's why ventilation system is really important, like ventilation recovery or method of ventilation, will help with that kind of moisture.
I even try to put AC in, doing this, you know, in
winter.
You know, that noise, and put in the plants, but it's still developed. We'll have to move from anyway, but I mean, you know, other homes, then they have been there, you know, plants still not really, I I feel sorry for some of the tenants that, you know, have to go through this.
Yeah, I have to say this is a very common issue. So, and it's solvable. The problem is we need money, we need to do things properly, and we need to be able to, like, especially if we have tenants, we need to be responsible for the house of tenants. I think there is a really nice report by the Housing Ombudsman that talks about the title is "It's Not Lifestyle."
Yeah.
Because it's really important to
Yeah.
make sure that it's the building that should be fit for habitation, and it's not that the occupants are cooking too much, showering too much. We should be able to do that.
We should be able to do that.
And I could see too much blame on the tenants when actually the buildings need to be fit for purpose.
And as you said, there have been some high-profile cases where the occupants were blamed for very simple lifestyle action. So yeah, it's a really, really important point, and I do think it's an important issue as well. I think there's a question at the back. If you can move the microphone. I think that one will be faster. Thank you.
Quick question for Kia.
Sorry, could you please introduce yourself?
I'm Matthew. I'm actually from Norway. I'm from a startup called Vinda, an energy tech startup. In your presentation, you had a slide where you looked at I think you put trigger points for when you consider retrofits. It's an observation that we've had as well. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how you identified those trigger points and what that was based on. I think you talked about it, but I missed some detail. Specifically regards to nesting and sort of people buying that forever. I wondered if that was something you identified, and if you had anything to mention on that.
Thank you so much for your question. So in terms of trigger points, that wasn't something that we had come up with ourselves, but something that we all base our work in this area around. I think it was an EST one. We did do some in-depth investigation of key trigger points as part of previous projects that looked generally at retrofit and not at how to decarbonize homes. So things that did come up with particular home groups are things like moving home. It's a good opportunity to approach people because they'll be doing works anyway. And you know, in terms of doing their works, it's an opportunity to specify better products to them. Some works that could be put in while sort of things are ongoing, because you reduce the hazard factor in the long term. Another thing we saw was looking at people who have owned their homes for longer, because if there's an intention to settle, then there's an intention to improve in a sense as well. So that, I think, speaks to sort of that nesting element that you looked at. One thing is that these previous studies looked at people sort of in a uniform way and didn't look at people who might be more vulnerable. So it looked at standard occupants. But I think there is now sort of a case to be made for looking at what are the trigger points for more vulnerable people, or people who are more disadvantaged, or people who are fuel poor, because they'll have a lot of things to contend with. So their trigger points will be different.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, one more question there. So yeah, please introduce yourself and mention who would like to answer.
From the NN last year, and now I'm working in greenhouse research. I just have a question for Tim. Thanks for sharing the case study earlier. And I was just wondering, has there been any consideration regarding the embodied carbon in when you're replacing the gas burners? Because you just mentioned that there would be probably very little monetary benefit. So I'm thinking, is it possible that kind of indicating the embodied carbon impact could be quite significant? And just wondering how long the payback time will be. And also, has there been any consideration regarding the circularity? Has there been is there a link benefit or recycle for the demolished gas boilers? That's
Okay. Trying to start from the beginning. In answer to your question on embodied carbon, no, is the honest answer. And I think there's a number of reasons behind that. One of which, for the particular case that we looked at, also City Council's net zero carbon commitment is to operational carbon, and I think that's pretty much a widespread position for the vast majority of public sector bodies anyway. And we touched on earlier, embodied carbon for building services. There's really limited data out there in order to be able to get a really accurate reflection of where we are. So I think at the moment the industry is going through this transition period where we're trying to deliver solutions to meet commitments that's kind of based on a slightly outdated thought process, because we know that we need to be delivering low embodied carbon buildings, but we're just not in a position to do that for a variety of reasons. What I missed.
Good answer.
so clarity on that. Is there any waste management plant for demolished gas boiler?
The recycling of the gas boiler? No, not that I'm aware of. No, I mean that would sit within the contractor's waste management plan. Not something that if I'm honest, I'm overly familiar with.
Thank you. So I'm afraid we only have time for one more question. Yes, please.
Thanks very much. Billboard has question largely for Esfan and Ken. I mean, we've talked about it body, but on operational, it seems to me on a zero carbon journey, we haven't had much of a map, because essentially the reporting and comparison and motivation of that has been absent for the last 20 years since energy consumption guides and things were abandoned. And display engine certificates could have taken their place, but didn't for various lack of policy support. So the issue is where we go now. It's government seems to be looking to industry and academia to solve this problem. But it seems to me that without government providing the infrastructure, which things could be clearly communicating and motivating, not by a one-size-fits-all thing, by actually people going sensibly on this journey. We can never quite get there. You know, we've had lots of chances, we haven't got any more. How can we bring things together better now? How can we encourage government to do that?
Would like to go first, yeah.
I can try. That's also, of course, related to our question, what government can do basically here. So I couldn't agree more. Bill, that was a missed opportunity I think, in terms of the DEC scheme, display energy the certificates, basically to extend it to all buildings. We could update our benchmarks. It's interesting that, for example, SIPC protocol that underpins the DEC scheme has not been updated since 2008. Despite the fact that we have the empirical evidence thanks to the DEC scheme now to update it. Now it's 15 years, we haven't done it. I understand that they would like to basically maintain the consistency of the scheme, certification scheme, but at the same time, I think we should be able actually to update our benchmarks, if not within that protocol, by other means. And governments, yes, basically leadership is required here, academia should also help, but it's a very, very valid point. But also, I would like to link your question to an earlier question and Tim's response, in the sense that, again, it appears that we are basically following this piecemeal implementation of different policies. For example, focus on operational carbon and ignoring the impact in terms of embodied carbon. So we really need to adopt a holistic approach that covers both aspects and have the right metrics in place, the right empirical evidence in place. So that's a big question, both for academia, for us, for the industry, but also for the governments. And we really need to link all these missing pieces together, because I'm just thinking we basically go through this decarbonization plan at scale in terms of operational carbon, and then down the line we figure out, okay, there's an adverse impact, environmental impact in terms of embodied carbon. We didn't factor that in. Then, to a large extent, it reminds me of the issue that we had in terms of transition from petrol to diesel engines a few years ago, and the impact in terms of air quality. So it's the same thing, and we are repeating ourselves. We are repeating our mistakes, and we really need to have this basically thinking of this theme of system thinking approach to these things to bring everything together. And on that, actually, I'm quite pleased to say in the afternoon when Dr. Salman Hatterley presented the net right that's ID and HMM to do it together. At least in that one, we try to come up with a more holistic definition of net zero that links embodied carbon to operational. Because when you go to our EBA climate emergency targets, related targets, and so on, you have different targets, standalone targets for embodied and operational. The question is, how can we link this? What is the true definition of a net zero building over life cycle, encompassing both operational and embodied? So I'll leave that question out, but I'm sure Simon will come back to no question, Simon.
I'll keep my response really brief. I think ultimately it just needs to be more stick, in terms of policy. Part L to comply with is not particularly onerous. It's the lowest benchmark that we need to meet. There are obviously local authority driven requirements, which generally are more onerous than the mandatory requirements, which we see implemented, and there are obviously also client aspirations to achieve benchmarks, but ultimately, if there's not a higher benchmark, most people would have really easier to meet.
So one very final question for
it seems that all of you seem to be crying out for sensible legislation and sensible investment frameworks. And I wondered, with the new Energy Performance of Buildings Directive revision having passed through the EU Parliament, mandating disclosure of operational performance, requiring whole life carbon limits for buildings, and the Construction Products Directive about to go through mandating EPDs for environmental product declarations, and that somebody is beginning to implement some of these in the EU. do you think that might provide some political impetus in the UK to take similar action, or are we just going to leave it beyond?
I would like to answer this.
It's more a political question for Brexit, I suppose. The current governments are not open. I don't think the prospect of that being implemented very soon, but I think in due course, of course, there will be an impact, increasing pressure from the industry, using the EU example, basically, as a very possibility. And again, hopefully at one point we will be able to harmonize building rates and again use EPBD to implement legislations. First develop and then implement legislations that are not necessarily the same, but of course in terms of the purpose, in terms of the objectives, follow the same objectives. Really that I have discussed this over the years. We have our own criticism against the EPBD, of course. Disclosure of operational data is great, but this issue that we are dealing with in terms of asset rating EPC actually originated from the EPBD. So this is an ongoing debate. But having said that, I don't think we are progressive now post Brexit. So we have not come up with a better solution. The only exception I can think of in the context of the commercial real estate sector is basically an enabling system. So that's a welcome development. As I mentioned in my presentation, it's a very niche part of the market, but it remains to be seen to what extent it will be effective and help us in achieving that critical mass. But apart from that, its portal is effectively the framework is very similar to the EPBD, and basically it was as a result of the implementation of the EPBD that developed this framework in the first place. It's a legacy issue that we're still dealing with. So it has to be an ongoing debate, and this ongoing conversation with our EU counterparts is always part and parcel of the solution. Welcome development at the EU level.
Right. So I would like now to invite everyone to continue this very interesting conversation over lunch. Another round of applause for excellent speakers.